Welcome back to the channel. We got a fun article today. It's titled, I Grew Up Believing These 7 Old West Myths. Turns out they're completely wrong. I grew up thinking I knew the Old West. Cowboys, shootouts, saloons, all the stuff you see in movies. It wasn't until I got older and started digging into real history that I realized a lot of what I believed was flat out wrong. Turns out the real Old West was way messier, more diverse, and sometimes even stranger than the legends we grew up hearing. Here are 7 myths about the Old West that fooled me and probably fooled you too. Myth number 1, guns were everywhere and everyone was armed. Despite what Hollywood would have you believe, the Old West wasn't a non-stop gunfight. In fact, gun control was often stricter in frontier towns than in modern cities. By the late 1800s, places like Tombstone, Arizona, and Dodge City, Kansas, had laws requiring visitors to surrender their firearms upon entering town. The iconic shootout at the OK Corral, that didn't happen because someone cheated at poker. It started because the Cowboys refused to comply with Tombstone's no guns ordinance. And it's not like 6-shooters were that efficient either. Cap and ball revolvers had short ranges and could burn your hand if fired too quickly. The preferred weapons were shotguns and rifles, not pistols, especially not for high noon duels, which were largely fictional. Myth number 2 was that cowboys invented cowboy culture. We tend to think of cowboys as a purely American phenomenon, but the truth is their roots are deeply Mexican. Decades before Plymouth Rock saw settlers, Mexican vaqueros were already taming the plains and driving cattle across rugged terrain. They wore wide-brimmed sombreros, rode horses expertly, and invented many of the cowboy terms still used today, like bronco and lariat. Even the modern cowboy hat had its roots in vaquero gear. The reality, American cowboys learned the trade from these early cattlemen, and it wasn't just white Americans in the saddle. About 1/3 of all cowboys were Mexican, and roughly 1/4 were black. Native Americans joined the cattle drives too, creating a multicultural cowboy community rarely acknowledged in Western lore. Myth number 3 was that bank robberies were a common occurrence. Thanks to silver screen outlaws like Butch Cassidy and the Dalton Gang, we've come to believe bank robberies were practically a daily event. In truth, bank heists were exceedingly rare in the Old West. Only about 8 confirmed cases occurred across 15 states over 4 decades. Compare that to the more than 5,000 bank robberies that occurred in just 1 year in the United States in 2010. Why weren't banks hit more often? Simple. Most cowboy western towns were tiny. The sheriff's office was usually right next door, and banks were often reinforced with heavy walls. The real money was in robbing stagecoaches or trains, which were isolated, slow-moving, and far easier to escape from. Myth number 4 was that cowboys all wore cowboy hats. Sure, people wore hats in the Old West, but they weren't the 10-gallon types we imagine today. In fact, the bowler hat, yes, that round-topped city slicker hat, was far more popular. Billy the Kid reportedly wore a top hat, while Wild Bill Hickok favored a flat pancake-style woman's hat. The original cowboy hat, the boss of the plains, looked more like something an Amish farmer might wear. It wasn't until Hollywood and rodeo performers got involved that the wide-brimmed, curled-edge style became the cowboy standard. most of what we associate with cowboy fashion is more costume than history. Myth number 5 was that playing cards were just a fun pastime. Western saloons always seemed to feature a tense poker game, often ending in a gunfight, but the reality was even more serious. Card games in the Old West were no casual affair. They were often a legitimate profession. Gambling halls, saloons, and even brothels hosted formal card tournaments, and the best players made names for themselves, much like modern-day athletes. This wasn't about having fun after a long day on the trail. It was a high-stakes, high-reward business, and skilled card players were as respected as any pros today. Casual players were likely to get taken for everything they had, and maybe a black eye for their trouble. Myth number 6 was that prostitution meant misery and poverty. It's easy to assume that prostitutes in the Old West lived desperate, miserable lives. While it's true that the work was hard and came with social stigma, many women in the trade were far better off than commonly believed. Brothel owners, known as madams, were often among the wealthiest and most influential women in town. These women had access to luxuries, education, and legal protections that were rare for the time. Some even hired guards or worked with law enforcement to keep their businesses safe. It wasn't an easy life, but it could be surprisingly profitable and came with freedoms other women of the era rarely had. Myth number 7 was that settlers were constantly attacked by Native Americans. Perhaps the most enduring myth of the Old West is the constant conflict between settlers and Native Americans. While there were clashes, they were not nearly as frequent as movies and folklore suggest. Out of hundreds of thousands of settlers traveling west, only a few hundred, roughly 300 to 400, lost their lives in such encounters. By contrast, disease, starvation, and accidents were much bigger threats. Native Americans were more often trading partners or guides for wagon trains than enemies. The famous circling the wagons tactic, that was typically done to keep livestock from wandering, not to fight off attacks. Ironically, it was far more common for settlers to initiate violence than the other way around. There you have it. I grew up believing these 7 Old West myths. Turns out they're completely wrong. Some pretty interesting information there. The article goes on to include some additional information. Let's continue. The article continues to discuss why circling wagons wasn't a battle plan. One of the most iconic images of the Old West is that of settlers forming a circle with their wagons to fend off incoming Native American attacks. While this makes for great drama, the real reason for forming wagon circles was far more practical and much less exciting. Pioneers arranged their wagons in a circle at night to keep their valuable livestock, especially cattle and oxen, from wandering off. It created a makeshift corral, not a battlefield fortification. In reality, wagon trains were often spread out across miles of terrain, making it nearly impossible to quickly form a defensive circle in a sudden emergency. If hostile encounters did occur, and they rarely did, there was little time to stage elaborate defenses. This false narrative of circling wagons for battle persists because it captures the imagination, but the truth is far more mundane and rooted in livestock management, not warfare. The article also claims that Hollywood's Wild West was a fabricated fantasy. The myths of the Old West were born not just from exaggeration, but from entertainment. Stories needed heroes, villains, and high-stakes drama, and facts were often the first casualty. high noon duels, ruthless bank robbers, and lone cowboys on windswept plains made for compelling narratives. But they don't hold up to historical scrutiny. Real life in the West was messy, slow, diverse, and often much more mundane than we like to admit. The article also states that the real West was complex, not wild. Behind the myths lies a more honest and fascinating version of the Old West, one defined by cultural exchange, complex laws, unexpected diversity, and a surprising amount of structure. The truth might not be as cinematic, but it's far more human. Understanding the realities of this era helps us to better appreciate the stories that did emerge and recognize the difference between romantic fiction and historical fact. So next time someone talks about dueling cowboys and bank robbing outlaws, remember, the truth may be quieter, but it's no less captivating. There you go, that completes the article, The 7 Old Myths, with plus some additional information. If you enjoyed this article, please take a second to hit that thumbs up and get it in front of a few more eyes. You can go ahead and hit that big thumbs up now. And if you really enjoy this type of content, please consider subscribing to the channel. Hey, while you're at it, don't forget to get in that comment section. Go ahead and comment your favorite Western movie. I'm being interested to hear what your favorite Western movie is. Maybe I can give it a watch.